India is in talks with several countries in Africa to help them build a UPI-like digital payment system. The National Payments Corporation of India, or the NPCI, which runs UPI, is reportedly in talks with at least 20 nations in Africa and South America to build a similar system. Though the authority has not revealed the names of all of the nations, it signed a deal with Namibia in May to help it build a real-time payment system.
For decades, America's power didn't rely only on its military or its dollar, it relied on something subtler: digital dominance. From Silicon Valley's software to Washington's sanctions, from Facebook's algorithms to the US dollar's payment rails, America built a world where the flow of information, money, and power ran through its systems. But in the last few years, quiet tremors began to unsettle that foundation. And the epicenter wasn't in Beijing this time, it was in New Delhi, stretching deep into Africa. When African nations began adopting India's Unified Payments Interface (UPI) and digital ID systems, few in Washington paid attention. It looked like a South-South development story, not a geopolitical threat. But when those same systems started replacing Western finance platforms, when trade settlements began shifting from SWIFT to rupee-based corridors, when African startups sought Indian investors instead of American venture capital, the alarms in DC quietly began to sound. To American policymakers, it wasn't just about economics. It was about influence. For decades, the U.S. has used its control over financial systems to shape global policy, sanctions, aid, and access, all tied to the dollar. But a world where African trade runs through Indian systems, that's a world where Washington's leverage starts to fade. In early policy briefings, U.S. analysts began calling it the digital non-aligned movement. A revival of old Cold War language, but this time not about missiles, about code. India, they said, was exporting sovereignty, helping Africa connect without dependence on the dollar or Western banks, and that made Washington uneasy. Officially, the U.S. welcomed India's leadership in Africa. Unofficially, it worried that India's model was becoming too successful. Because for America, influence has always been built on exclusivity: control the platform, shape the policy. But India's open-source model threatened that playbook. It offered digital independence at scale, something Washington had never done. And yet, the U.S. faces a paradox. India is not an adversary, it's a partner. Both share democratic values, both counterbalance China. So when India's influence grows, Washington must ask, is this competition or evolution? Behind closed doors, American tech giants are already responding. Google, Microsoft, and Amazon Web Services have expanded data partnerships in Africa, racing to build infrastructure that keeps the U.S. within the continent's digital bloodstream. But unlike before, there is a new player at the table, and this one speaks the language of the developing world. India's rise in Africa exposes something Washington rarely admits. Its model of engagement is outdated. Where America offers aid, India offers APIs. Where America preaches democracy, India shares code. Where America builds institutions, India builds platforms. For young African entrepreneurs, that difference matters. It feels practical, inclusive, less like intervention, more like partnership. And that's a narrative America can't easily compete with. In 2024, several U.S. policy think tanks quietly urged the government to re-engage digitally with Africa, not just through aid, but through infrastructure. They warned that ignoring India's success could make the U.S. a spectator in the global South's digital revolution. But acting on that advice isn't simple, because America's strategy, built over decades, depends on control, and India's, by design, depends on sharing. This new dynamic creates tension, not of enemies, but of equals. Both Washington and New Delhi want a connected, stable Africa, but they want it to connect through their systems. And in that silent tug of war, every fiber cable, every app, every payment trail becomes strategic territory. While Washington still dominates defense and finance, it's losing ground in digital diplomacy, the battle for hearts, code, and connectivity. Every time an African startup builds on Indian technology instead of American, every time a trade deal bypasses the dollar, America's digital empire quietly shrinks, not from sanctions or wars, but from irrelevance. Yet America is not out of the game, far from it. Washington has begun quietly aligning with India on several fronts: cybersecurity, data protection, and AI ethics. If India's digital model spreads responsibly, the U.S. stands to benefit from a new form of democratic digital order. But if it grows too independent, if Africa and India create systems that function beyond the dollar's reach, then the world may witness a subtle realignment of global power unlike anything since the end of the Cold War. For America, this isn't just about India or Africa. It's about control over the narrative of globalization itself, a narrative that once began in Silicon Valley, but may now be rewritten in Bengaluru, Nairobi, and Lagos. In this new digital order, the US no longer commands the system, it must compete within it. And as Africa connects through Indian-built trails and Asian-designed networks, Washington faces its hardest question yet. Can America thrive in a world where it no longer writes the code of power, but merely reads it? Africa's next revolution won't be fought with soldiers. It'll be fought with SIM cards, satellites, and code, because while Washington was busy policing the world, India was quietly wiring Africa into its digital web. What began as a few telecom towers and payment taps has now become a silent empire, an empire built not on land but on data. From Lagos to Nairobi, Kigali to Accra, Indian companies are rewriting Africa's digital DNA. Airtel Africa connects more than 150 million Africans. UPI, India's homegrown payment system, is now expanding across the continent, and Indian IT giants like Tech Mahindra, Tata, and Infosys are building the servers that run African governments. To the world, it looks like business. But to Washington, it looks like a geopolitical takeover. For decades, America controlled Africa's connectivity. Silicon Valley decided which app you used, the IMF decided who funded your tech projects, and US companies harvested the data. But today, the pipeline of Africa's digital economy is no longer American. It's... In 2010, India was still seen as a call center nation, a service hub for Western tech giants. 15 years later, it's building its own internet and exporting it. The Digital India mission didn't just transform India. It became a template, a digital blueprint now being copied across Africa. Take Kenya. In 2024, Nairobi signed a deal to adopt India's unified payments interface, the same system that processed over 100 billion transactions in India. What does that mean? It means Africa's street vendors can now trade directly with India's markets without the US dollar, without Western banks, and without Washington's permission. The dollar dominated the old world. The rupee code might dominate the new one. And that's not just a payment story, it's a power shift. While American policymakers debate aid packages, India is building partnerships, real ones. It trains African coders through Digital India Africa programs, helps set up fiber optic lines through Indian-funded telecoms, and even shares AI governance models with African regulators. This isn't charity, it's strategy. Think this way. Every transaction, every login, every mobile payment creates data. And in 2025, data is the new gold. India knows it, Africa has it, and America lost it. From satellites in space to undersea cables, India's digital footprint now covers almost every major African economy. Even Bharti Airtel, originally an Indian telecom, has become one of Africa's largest digital operators, outpacing many American firms that once dominated the continent. Behind the scenes, Indian engineers are installing the very infrastructure that powers Africa's mobile money systems that once relied on US technology. And here's where the story gets controversial. The US doesn't see India's digital expansion as development, it sees it as displacement. A Washington-based think tank recently called India's tech presence in Africa a shadow network undermining Western cybersecurity influence. Translation: India is doing in Africa what the US used to do everywhere else, building dependence through technology. Behind closed doors, American officials are worried that India's data networks might one day align fully with the BRICS digital currency system, a system designed to bypass the dollar completely. If that happens, Africa's entire fintech future could run through Indian servers, not American ones. So when you hear about India's digital diplomacy, understand what it really means. It's not just we fight ours or cheap apps. It's sovereignty. It's who owns the code that runs your country. India has learned the most powerful lesson of modern geopolitics, that in the 21st century, you don't need to invade nations. You just need to connect them. To the ordinary African, India's digital rise feels like opportunity, cheaper access, faster networks, better trade. But to the US, it feels like the end of monopoly, a rival democracy controlling the next billion users. And yet, the irony is this: America helped create India's tech giants. India learned from Silicon Valley and then built something more affordable, more adaptable, and more African. Washington exported capitalism. New Delhi exported code. From the outside, it looks like progress. From inside the Pentagon, it looks like power migration. India's rise in Africa isn't just about digital inclusion, it's the foundation of a new world order, one where Washington's dominance is slowly replaced by a quiet Indian algorithm flowing through Africa's veins, one bite at a time. Africa's future isn't being written in Washington anymore, it's being coded in Bangalore, a country that powered global tech from behind a screen. Today, that same nation is exporting entire digital ecosystems. The transformation began quietly in 2015 with a single idea: Digital India, a government push to connect every village, every citizen, every business to the internet, not as consumers of technology, but as creators of it. Underneath the slogans were three revolutions that changed everything: cheap data, universal identity, and real-time payments. When Reliance Jio entered the market in 2016, the cost of mobile data collapsed by over 90%. Suddenly, 500 million Indians could stream, trade, and learn online in a country of 1.4 billion. Data became as common as air. By 2020, India generated more mobile internet traffic than the United States and China combined, a digital surge that built the foundation for the next leap: nationwide digital identity. Aadhaar, the world's largest biometric program, gave over 1 billion people a verifiable digital identity. It turned the chaotic paper bureaucracy into a single digital network. For the first time, a street vendor in Delhi or a farmer in Assam could open a bank account with just a thumbprint. With identity came inclusion. With inclusion came innovation. Then came UPI, the Unified Payments Interface, an open-source payment rail created not by a company, but by India's central bank and local developers. By 2024, it processed more than 100 billion transactions a year, more than Visa and MasterCard in India combined. UPI's success sent a clear message: developing nations could design financial systems that were fast, secure, and nearly free. Together, these systems, cheap data, digital identity, and instant payments, formed the backbone of a new kind of power: digital sovereignty. India had built not just software but infrastructure, a national digital stack that was open, scalable, and exportable. As the platforms matured, other nations began to take notice. Asian neighbors wanted the payment system. Small Pacific islands asked for identity frameworks. And then Africa, a continent with the youngest population on Earth, came knocking. India's message was simple: we built this once, we can help you build it too. Unlike Western firms that sold closed products, India offered public digital goods, open APIs, low-cost infrastructure, and technical training. This approach resonated with countries that couldn't afford billion-dollar tech imports. By the mid-2020s, Indian companies had evolved from outsourcing contractors into full-scale solution builders. Infosys ran global banking platforms. Tech Mahindra designed smart city grids. Airtel expanded across Africa, connecting 14 countries and more than 150 million subscribers. Every tower built, every fiber cable laid, carried more than calls and data, it carried influence. Montage students in Nairobi learning coding through Indian-funded programs, engineers in Addis Ababa attending a Bangalore webinar. India's technology outreach blended commerce with capacity building. Scholarships for African engineers, digital governance workshops, startup exchanges, each added a layer of familiarity with Indian standards and systems. To international observers, this wasn't aid or charity. It was soft power in its most modern form. Technology is never neutral. Who builds your network often shapes your choices, your data policies, even your economy's rhythm. India learned that truth from decades of dependence on Western software. Now it was designing tools other nations could depend on, but without the dominance that once came from Silicon Valley. This rebalancing didn't happen overnight. It grew from necessity, innovation, and timing. In the 20th century, nations exported oil, steel, and arms. In the 21st, India began exporting architecture, digital architecture. Each adoption of Indian systems abroad strengthened its relevance in global governance debates, from cybersecurity standards to data localization rules. It wasn't about empire in the old sense. It was about interoperability, a world wired in a language India had written. By 2025, India's IT and digital service exports crossed $250 billion. Over 20 countries used or tested components of India's digital public goods model. Indian fintech investments in Africa surpassed $15 billion, led by Airtel Money and UPI-linked startups. Each number tells a simple truth. India no longer just participates in the digital economy, it helps define it. Narrator crescendo building. As India perfected its model at home, Africa faced a similar challenge: billions of people, low financial inclusion, and a need for affordable technology. Western systems were expensive. Chinese systems came with political strings. India offered something different, open, adaptable, and proven. That offer would soon open an entire new chapter, one where Africa's digital heartbeat began to sync with India's servers. 1 billion people, half of them under the age of 25, all looking for one thing: connection. For decades, the continent's greatest challenge wasn't a lack of ambition. It was the cost of access. The hardware came from the West, the networks came from China, the policies came from the World Bank. But the software, the real engine of inclusion, had no local blueprint until India arrived with one. In 2010, less than 1 in 4 Africans had internet access. By 2025, that number had doubled, and behind much of that surge were Indian-built systems. Airtel Africa, a subsidiary of India's Bharti Airtel, became one of the continent's largest telecom providers, stretching from Nigeria to Tanzania, Ghana to Uganda. More than 150 million Africans now make calls, send money, and access the web through Indian technology. The company's model was simple but radical: affordable data, local partnerships, and mobile money at scale. What it achieved wasn't just growth, it was dependency through connectivity. But India's expansion didn't stop at telecoms. It reached deeper into education, banking, even government systems. Across Kenya, Rwanda, and Ethiopia, Indian universities opened partnerships to train developers. Tech Mahindra helped digitize government records. The Indian Institute of Technology set up exchange programs for African engineers. Each project looked small, but together they created an invisible architecture, one that slowly made Indian systems part of Africa's digital bloodstream. At first, this was seen as partnership: affordable, adaptable, and open-source India's tools fit Africa's needs perfectly. But as adoption grew, a quiet realization followed. To function, these systems relied on Indian servers, Indian standards, Indian security protocols. Africa wasn't just using Indian technology. It was beginning to think in Indian code. Fintech was the turning point. In 2023, Kenya signed a memorandum of understanding with India to explore UPI, the same instant payment system that revolutionized transactions across Asia. Within months, pilot programs linked local banks directly to India's payment trails. Suddenly, a trader in Nairobi could send money to Mumbai in seconds, bypassing Western banking corridors altogether. It felt like liberation. And in many ways, it was. But it also meant Africa's financial backbone was being built on someone else's infrastructure. Dependency is rarely visible in its early stages. It begins with convenience, cheaper data, faster payments, simpler apps. By the time systems mature, changing them becomes almost impossible. Behind the screens, engineers in Hyderabad maintain updates for software running in Abuja. Cybersecurity patches for government portals in Kigali are deployed from Pune. Even when local developers join the process, the technical standards trace back to India's digital stack. This is not dominance through control, it's dominance through compatibility. Yet for many Africans, India's rise isn't a threat, it's an opportunity. Unlike Western or Chinese models, India doesn't demand political alignment or exclusive contracts. It sells systems designed for the developing world: low cost, high scalability, easy adoption. A young entrepreneur in Ghana can build a fintech app using Indian APIs without paying a licensing fee to a Western company. A government in Malawi can set up a digital ID program without borrowing billions. These are tangible gains, practical, immediate, and empowering. But power always follows infrastructure. Whoever provides the rails eventually influences the direction of the train. As Indian standards spread across Africa, so do Indian norms. Open source governance, digital ID frameworks, and privacy laws inspired by New Delhi's own models. Each is a piece of policy exported along with technology. And while that may look cooperative, it raises a deeper question: when does partnership become dependency? African leaders often describe India as a brother in development. The phrase carries history, shared struggles, colonial parallels, and solidarity within the global South. But in the digital age, brotherhood also carries responsibility. India's presence is reshaping markets, training the next generation of coders, and connecting entire regions. Yet the more vital those systems become, the harder they are to replace. That is the paradox of digital friendship. If Africa's data flows through Indian-built servers and its citizens use Indian-designed IDs, then a small decision in Bangalore could one day echo in Banjul or Brazzaville. That is the invisible cost of dependency, not in money, but in momentum. Still, the exchange is not one-sided. African innovation is feeding back in too. India's tech ecosystem. Startups from Lagos are collaborating with Indian investors. Kenyan developers are contributing code to Indian fintech platforms. This is no longer a one-way flow. It's an evolving network, complex, interdependent, and strategic. For the first time, Africa has a partner that isn't trying to dictate ideology, but instead export infrastructure. And for the first time, India has found a continent that mirrors its own digital journey, vast, ambitious, and hungry for inclusion. But the closer their systems intertwine, the more difficult it becomes to separate influence from integration. Africa's digital rise carries India's fingerprints in its networks, its payments, its policies. What began as partnership now defines everyday life for millions. It's not a story of dominance or dependency alone, it's the story of two developing worlds shaping each other's future, and a quiet shift that the rest of the world is only beginning to notice.